The Cuban Revolution was an armed uprising in 1959 led by Fidel Castro that overthrew the tyrant Fulgencio Batista and introduced Cuba to become the communist country it is today. Fidel Castro went on to rule Cuba from 1959 to 2008. It is likely that no other revolution in history is significantly tied to one single person, as in the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro. But the revolution cannot be simplified as just the story of Fidel Castro. Decades of turmoil and conflict led to the success of this regime. Cuba's anti-US feelings and shift towards communism were not born during the 1959 revolution, but rather were rooted in their struggles of the 19th century. From 1898 to 1959, the Treaty of Reciprocal Trade existed through which the US government designed, decided, and controlled Cuba's future in politics and strongly tied the Cuban economy to US companies. This led to a list of consequences, which includes extreme poverty, unemployment up to 55%, health and education limited to minor sectors, 80% of the population being poor or low income, and state terrorism. Washington imposed anti-communism upon Cuban foreign policy and backed the Batista dictatorship until 1959, including plans to prevent the triumph of the rebel army fighting against tyranny led by Castro. Cuba had 3 wars of independence. The final came from the victory led by Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro Ruiz was born on August 13, 1926, to a family of sugar plantation owners. Although he worked as a boy on his family's sugarcane fields, he was well educated and continued his education as a young man at the University of Havana, where he studied law. During his law school years, he became active in politics and even participated in an attempt to overthrow the Trujillo dictatorship in 1947. He completed his degree in 1950, and by this time his political affiliation was with the Orthodox Party, which was against Fulgencio Batista's authentic party that turned to the right and became corrupt. Castro had the intent to run for Congress in 1952 against Batista, but Batista canceled the elections. This infuriated Castro and he went to court, charging Batista with violating the Constitution, but ultimately his petition was rejected. The defeat ignited Castro's career as a revolutionary leader. Two failed attacks led by Castro within 5 years that were meant to spark a general insurrection still did not make him and his followers renounce their desire to overthrow Batista. The first of the attacks was on July 26, 1953, against the Moncada army barracks organized between Castro and his brother Raul and accompanied by 165 men and women. Half of the group was killed and the 2 leaders were taken as prisoners. This day marked the name of their revolution as the July 26 movement. Almost 2 years later, the Castro brothers were released, but their work to overthrow the dictator was ignited more than ever. For the following year and a half, Castro traveled between the United States and Mexico to organize the July 26 movement, where another prominent communist revolutionary, Argentinian Ernesto Che Guevara, joined the fight. In 1956, Castro returned to Cuba for another failed attack on the government, resulting in him and his followers retaliating into the remote Sierra Maestra Mountains to continue their planning for overthrowing Batista. Castro was portrayed as a modern-day Robin Hood, which is important in understanding why he was able to influence and recruit locals to his movement in guerrilla warfare at this point. There was promise of land, reform, education, and democracy as well. Through all of his efforts, Castro and his guerrilla forces overthrew Batista in 1959, causing him to flee Cuba and leading Castro to assume military and political power as Cuba's prime minister. Cuba's relationship with the US began to deteriorate the year after the revolution, and Castro sought industrialization in order to reduce Cuba's dependence on sugar exports. Cuba's economy was largely dependent on sugar and tobacco production since colonial times. The government nationalized foreign-owned property, including the US's, which led to an embargo enacted by the Eisenhower administration and tightened by the Kennedy administration. It can be argued that the embargo hurt the Cuban economy, but within a few years, the state was the largest employer, wages were regulated, and private investment was insignificant. In 1960, Cuba and the USSR signed a trade agreement ensuring demand for Cuban sugar and compensating the loss of Cuban exports to the United States. In 1961, the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was an unsuccessful attempt to remove Castro from power. After the success at the Bay of Pigs on Castro's side, he declares the Cuban Revolution to be socialist and gains support from other socialist nations like China. These actions enhanced the isolation of the island in the Western world. After the revolution, Cuban government controlled the nation's freedom of speech, religion, and even sexuality. At the start of his revolution, Castro sought to control religion to maintain dominance. The government was most concerned with suppressing Catholicism, which was 70 to 75% of the population, as well as Afro-Cuban religions, which were the other majority. In 1961, the government exiled 130 priests, hundreds more fled, and by 1965, there were only 220 left on the island. 95% of the Jewish population left the island after the revolution as well. The government took control by instilling fear and taking control of church property, shutting down their schools, distributing anti-Catholic propaganda, and imprisoning those for counter-revolutionary action. Since all businesses were owned by the state at this point, restaurants and nightclubs frequented by members of the gay community were also controlled or closed, the same way church property was treated. Anti-homosexuality sentiment continued on for decades. For example, in the 1970s, homosexuality was declared as a departure from revolutionary principles, resulting in gays and lesbians losing their jobs and being expelled from the universities and the Communist Party of Cuba. The revolution had an agenda that wanted the population to comply with policies and not have any contradictory influences, whereas religious and sexual freedom were seen as threats. Not initially a socialist, Fidel Castro came to embrace socialism as a means to achieve Cuban independence once Cuba could no longer rely on the US. He went on to develop a reasonably successful system with universal healthcare, education, food security, and social services for the poor. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution survived because they tapped into their deep nationalism and desire for independence.